And hello and welcome to another episode of Startup Caps, your eye on startup capital movements in Africa, where we'll be unpacking just exactly where the capital is going when it comes to new ventures in Africa. In today's episode, we take a deeper look into gender lens investing, a growing area that highlights investment in women-led or women impact businesses. In 2023 alone, 16% of total venture capital in Africa was directed towards these enterprises, emphasizing a shift towards gender equity in the business landscape. Let's start off by taking a look at how investments with a gender lens are reshaping the future of African startups.
Recent studies have revealed significant gender disparities in financing within Africa's startup ecosystem, highlighting the need for focused attention and action. Let's take a look at some of the specifics of those disparities. Despite all female teams making up 11% of startups, they received only 3% of the total investment since 2013, compared to 76% received by all male teams. Female founders are underrepresented in high investment sectors like fintech and overrepresented in lower investment areas such as education and health technologies. There exists a notable confidence gap, where female founders reported having less confidence in pitching to investors, despite having comparable education and experience levels to male founders. Female-led startups are twice as likely to hire women and 4 times more likely to appoint them in managerial roles, fostering significant workplace diversity. Though still underrepresented, 2022 saw a modest increase in venture capital to female-led startups, making a slow but positive change.
And now that we've explored the current state of affairs, let's hear from the decision makers shaping the gender lens investment landscape. I begin my conversation today with Sandrine Henton, Managing Director at EG Capital, and Tokunbo Ishmael, Managing Director and co-founder at Alethea Capital. So Sandrine, we're talking gender lens right now. What I find quite interesting with your company, EG Capital, is that you are focusing on gender and climate. How important is the gender lens when it comes to investing in Africa, and why gender and climate?
Amazing question. So for us, it's climate adaptation, right? Africa is only 3% of global emissions. We will suffer the worst consequences of climate change. Therefore, we invest in food security, health resilience, education. And when we think about, so that's quite clear, I think from a climate perspective, when we think about the role of women in those sectors, who pays the groceries, the healthcare bill and the school fees, and who are the women farmers, teachers and nurses? These are women. So women are predominantly really overrepresented in our sectors, both as consumers, as employees, but also as sometimes women founders that are also leading some of those businesses, but also women allocators that are also investing in those sectors, because there is a succession of wealth to women also happening, and women tend to allocate much differently. And there's been a lot of studies that prove that when a woman is allocating, such as ourselves or some of our investors, we're more likely actually to allocate to food, health and education. So these are great correlations, because we very much need private capital to go into climate adaptation. Zambia, Namibia are suffering droughts at the moment. We know the effects of food security and the effect it has on communities and resilience of communities, and therefore, this is a great opportunity for return and impact and driving more private capital into that.
So then, Tokunbo, where are we in terms of representation?
We're still very low. If I start from ownership, you find that over 50% of businesses across Africa are owned by women, but they're not scaling fast enough, because less than 5% of all the funding that goes into businesses on the continent goes to female founders or gender diverse teams. And so my fund, Alethea, what we set out to do when we started doing gender diverse investing, gender smart investing, was to move the needle on being intentional about getting funds into the hands of female founders and gender diverse teams, and ensuring gender consciousness at the board, in management, better environment for female employees, and gender consciousness and smartness in the value chain. Now, this is not just a moral obligation, it's actually an economic imperative, because the statistics show that when you have gender diverse teams and you have female founders, they're outperforming homogeneous teams by at least 20% in some cases. And what we think about is also the dividends of diversity. We talk about better corporate governance. I'm sure there are many case stories that you've covered around how, like single groupthink teams have led us down the wrong path with corporate governance. Same with better decision making, effective decision making. When you have a diversity of perspectives around the table, companies are making better decisions, and that's what's enabling those diverse teams to outperform. And also with innovation, different perspectives. You can't have a single male-dominated team thinking about the products for a company, especially if you have female consumers. Yeah. And by the way, over $15 trillion across the global economy is in the hands of female consumers, who are the chief decision makers or purchasers of goods and services. So if you're not considering the tastes and preferences of this diverse group, your products are not going to reach the potential that they need to reach. And for us in Africa, it's about ordinary Africans reaching their full potential and understanding that Africa can't reach its full potential if we only play with half of our football team.
Exactly, and you both paint the picture, you paint the case for investing in female ventures. But a part of the research and a lot of the commentary that has come through is that there's actually a lack of investors, that they say, and we had it in an earlier conversation on the show, that you're more likely to invest in those that look like you, that feel familiar. So how do we get more female investors? I mean, I'm thrilled that I have 2 at the table right now, but how do we get more?
It's a pipeline issue.
It's an imperative as well, and I think that on the investor side there's a couple of trends that really give us hope in terms of what we're seeing in our fund with EG Capital. Is we're targeting 60% of private sector investors, and out of that 60% we're expecting actually 40% is African institutional investors, African banks, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. Africa has got 30 sovereign wealth funds worth about $200 billion. 12 of them last year clubbed together under the Africa Sovereign Investor Forum. And these are nations putting their wealth and resources to mobilize that for impact investing and private equity. And they understand very well the development issues and the market opportunities on the continent, and that is a great trend to actually have more local capital coming into these climate and gender strategy that are going to move the needle both in terms of returns and impact, and really driving the capital where it's needed. And I think the other trend that we see is what I've mentioned earlier. When we talk about family offices, there is in Africa it's usually a family business, and that family business, due to succession planning, is going to transition to soon a family office where women will be put in a position to manage and allocate wealth. So we will see much more women allocating wealth, much more institutional African allocating. If we read the latest AFCA report, there's still a predominantly private equity industry that is financed by development finance institutions outside of the continent. So that trend should be reversed, and the returns should stay locally, and a greater participation of a different type of investors at the table. Yeah.
Just to add to that, we really need to be intentional. So all this money can come, all the flows can come, but if we're not intentional about making sure that even at the investor level that there's diversity, we won't get anywhere. because to overcome the unconscious bias. And really, when we talk about unconscious bias, we're talking about a performance bias and an affinity bias. Affinity bias is what she just mentioned, that you're likely to invest in someone that looks like you. So of course, we need to have more women, not just to invest in other women that look like them, but also to invest in a diverse type of businesses that maybe the male counterparts might not see. The other side is the performance bias, where typically people think because the male investor is a bit more outspoken that they must be doing better. So for you to get to maybe the more introverted and quiet investor, who in some cases is typically the woman, you need to be intentional about bringing them in. And then when you bring them in, be intentional about retention policies, because women do go off and do other things like have babies. And how do you make sure that the environment is nurturing for them to be able to do those other aspects of being the chief carer at home and also running an investment firm?
And you know what? An interesting fact that I love, when it comes to the listed space, women are actually better investors. Absolutely. They have better returns, and simply because their let's say affinity to risk is a lot more calculated.
Absolutely.
So this
decision making.
Exactly.
This is what we're saying.
But then you mentioned a very important word just now: pipeline. Yes. When we talk about gender outside of investing, let's talk about the work environment. A lot of the times there's the counter argument that women are not putting themselves forward for leadership positions and things like this. What about pipeline? Do we have a sufficient pipeline when it comes to female founders? And I'll start with you.
Well, a statistic I always use, and I turn to my male colleagues and say, when you were in business school, when you were in school, there were probably 50-50 in the classroom. So we all got the good education, and that's where it all starts. And firms need to be intentional. Again, the hirers, the recruiters, they need to be intentional about looking for these smart women. There is an abundance. But if you just are passive and take whatever CV comes your way and not say, hang on, how come I'm not seeing a broad set of CVs? And by the way, my firm, founded by women, we are also intentional about making sure that we look for male CVs. And the same way that people say there's a pipeline issue on the female side, we also sometimes say it's hard to find a good man that can make good investments. So intentionality is key. The pipeline is there, but we need to make sure we're intentional about recruiting and retaining them.
To add to that, I think that for us, we look at diversity broadly. So it is gender, racial, as well as diversity of backgrounds, diversity of thinking, because this is what generates, you know, the reducing bias in investment decision making and better returns and better performance, ultimately. It has to go through recruitment, intentionality, having equal panels before we actually start the interviews, but also I would say retention, incentive, and also understanding that if there is a lack of pipeline for certain strategies, for example, where a track record is needed and simply the industry started with a different pool of candidates that wasn't diverse enough, then there are ways to couch for that still, because women in M&A, women in corporate finance, women in auditing would make fantastic investment manager. And I'm very keen to offer the opportunity for women to come into our fund at a certain level and build a track record and really move up. And I think for me, the biggest transformation journey was changing the incentives. So having carried interest redistributed to the team, 65% at all levels, from associates to directors, including the support functions. Having an employee-owned model where people in the team can also take up ownership of the firm, changes the culture, changes the incentive, and really builds for people to move up and to develop, and for the firm to be more sustainable longer term, and for the asset manager to thrive. And I think this is very different from what we've seen in private equity, where typically it is a small group at the partnership level that stays for a very long time. And of course, if that industry was started by men, it makes it more challenging for women to pierce through. So we've got to change not only the pipeline and the recruitment, changing the incentive and some of the redistribution of ownership and carried interest, make women part of it, make Black African part of it, make people from different backgrounds part of it. That will generate much, much better investment returns.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
Thank you so
much.
much.
That's what we do.
Exactly. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear from two female founders that have really done incredibly well when it comes to raising and building sustainable businesses that operate in Africa. I'm joined by Aisha Pandor, co-founder and CEO of Sweep South, and Bola Bardet, founder of Susu. Now, in starting off, I want to get your perspective and insights when it comes to raising as female founders. Aisha, my first question is to you. What was that experience like for you? Did you find that you were confronted with gender biases of sorts?
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks for having me. So, yeah, absolutely. I think it's well known that representation in terms of funding for women entrepreneurs has quite a long way to go still, particularly when it comes to the tech ecosystem. And this was my experience. I started my business 10 years ago when, the situation for women was even more dire. I think at that point, there were very few female-focused funds in South Africa and on the continent. And it was difficult, firstly, to have male investors understand the challenges that my business was solving. So, the challenge around access to home services, around home service providers, needing to find work and employment opportunities. And it took a while to sort of convince them of the opportunity that was inherent in the business that we were building. And then the second thing is, of course, representation. It's so important to see people who look like you around the table in the ecosystem. And that was another challenge that was unexpected that I faced going into tech, was just, often speaking to rooms of people who looked very different to me.
I can imagine. And Bola, coming to you, you set up your business in Europe and also raised from Europe. I'm quite curious to hear if there was a particular reason to that. Did you find that the capital that you were looking for was more amenable in Europe?
Yes, my experience was also very challenging because basically we are operating in Francophone African countries, Côte d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Senegal, and these regions are not very, I would say, exposed to worldwide or global investors. So we need to talk to investors who are familiar with our regions. And the other challenge that we face was that basically operating in healthcare is not the most attractive VC activity. So I would say that facing three challenges at the same time, being a woman entrepreneur, being operating in Francophone Africa, and third, being operating in a healthcare environment. So I knew that from the beginning it will be very challenging. It will take more time. So I multiplied my efforts. It took 15 months to close our last round, our 4.5 million round. And on average, it's supposed to be around 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, and congratulations on that round. We want to support you. But Aisha, coming to you, I mean, earlier on when we were speaking to some of the female investors, one of the things that they pointed out was the fact that it is easier for an investor to invest in someone that in a way looks like them, that behaves like them, that feels familiar. It's a question of understanding, and not necessarily a negative bias, but just that there's a human likeness to being more able to invest in those that are more like you because you understand them quite simply. How do you feel about the investor landscape? Are there enough female investors? And do you also agree with the statement that that could help have more female-led startups?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree with that sentiment. I think, there are two things. The one is, of course, that we want to fund people that we have a connection with, who we feel sort of mirror our own experiences. The other is the problem space, of course. So, if you're building in a space that, primarily impacts women, again, whether it's home services, whether it's, healthcare, where women might have specific challenges. And if you're building to solve some of those challenges, it can be difficult for someone who hasn't personally faced that to really understand the scope and scale of the opportunity. There's also obviously risk and opportunity perception that, that often works against women. And so absolutely having more women investors in the space, which is a really encouraging trend that I've seen over the last 10 years, has been a huge help for women entrepreneurs who are starting up in the space. And I've, personally seen the traction from sort of early stage women investing to seeing some larger funds. So whether it's, Alethea IDF with their $100 million fund, or TLCom, who recently announced that they had another big, I think it was a $50 million gender lens investing fund. So, it's great to see these opportunities that are able to support later stage women focused startups as well. So, encouraging movements, lots of organizations sort of championing angel investors, women angel investors, and again, good traction, but not enough. Of course, we know that the stats are still bad. Around 2% of venture capital goes to women-focused teams, women-focused businesses. So, there's still a very, very big gap that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few networks, a few funds that have a focus on gender lens. And I'm quite curious, Bola, how has support networks or even mentorship played a role in your founder journey?
We don't have a lot of them, unfortunately. I wish I had more of this kind of organization, more of this ecosystem to support during my founder's journey and my fundraising journey as well. Again, I insist that Francophone Africa is even worse than Anglophone African environment, because they are more mature, even for, I would say, the startup ecosystem. So very difficult. I would say that I have been exposed to more than 300 VC funds for the last fundraising, and I would say that less of 10 of them were actually women-focused fund. So yeah, I think there's still a lot to do there. And in terms of business angels, groups, etc., there were not a lot of them as well. So I think there's still a lot to do again around to support the women entrepreneur in the field.
Now, speaking to what still is to do, Aisha, what do you think the priority should be in ensuring, on the one hand, that we have more female investors, more funds that have a gender lens, but also, and I guess more importantly, that we create an environment where we can see more female-led startups?
I think Bola really summarized it well, right? Like, I think it's about the ecosystem and all of the facets that make up an ecosystem. So, you have entrepreneurs, and if you think about women-focused entrepreneurs or female entrepreneurs, particularly in the tech space, then you've got to think about STEM and STEM education, and women being brought up and going through the education system with engineering skills, with science skills, science backgrounds, being able to build, understanding entrepreneurship, seeing entrepreneurship as a friendly space and a space where your solutions are prioritized and seen as important. And so that's, again, just one facet of it. But there's, of course, even when we speak about investors, there are LPs who invest in investors' funds, right? And so where does that capital come from, and what do those capital structures look like, and who are the ultimate decision makers and the people who hold the purse strings? So it's multifaceted, and I think it has to do with, again, education, seeing this as a space that is accessible for women, equipping women with the skills to build support networks, incredibly important. I've, in the absence of having strong sort of networks and enough mentors who look like me, I've just decided to, try and be the mentor and the inspiration to other women, and to form my own support networks, even though they're small. So, WhatsApp groups with other female entrepreneurs and women in tech. So I think, we've got to try and build these structures ourselves, and we've got to attack the issue from multiple angles.
Yeah. And Bola, what do you think still needs to happen to make sure that we have more female founders?
I think Africa has the highest rate of women entrepreneurs, but this rate is unfortunately not reflected in the startup ecosystem. So what we need to do is basically to encourage women entrepreneurs, mentor them, give them some financial literacy around entrepreneurship and how to basically elaborate a little bit more in terms of business knowledge. And finally, I would say that they need also a good layer of digital training around all the tools, around AI, around the cloud systems, because this is really what changes the game today in the ecosystem, in the startup ecosystem. So I think we need to provide them with more support in terms of skill, because the entrepreneurship spirit is already there and it's even higher than on other continents.
Personally, as an African female, looking at the two of you, I'm excited about your businesses and what you represent to the rest of the women founders that are starting businesses on the continent. Thank you so much for joining us today and for giving us the insights and perspective as to what it's really like. I was joined by Aisha Pandor, co-founder and CEO of Sweep South, and Bola Bardet, founder of Susu. And this is how we wrap up Startup Caps this week. We'll do it again next week, this time looking into the world of agri-tech, because we all need to eat. Now make sure to continue the conversation with us on social media. You'll find us on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn and TikTok using the handle _StartupCaps and the hashtag StartupCapsAfrica. And of course, you can find out more about this week's episode by visiting our website, www.startupcaps.io. We'll see you again next week.